In this video, I'm going to discuss ServerCore. The assumption here is that you've installed Windows 2012, and if you're using ServerCore, you won't be able to use the GUI to configure your server, so you have to begin doing that using ServerCore, which is mostly the command line. Although you can use the server manager from another server to manage it, and we'll talk about some of those things here. So ServerCore is suited for the following situations. You'll use it when it's acting as a secondary domain controller to provide redundancy for Active Directory. You certainly don't need the UI in that case. As a branch office server when remote administration is more likely, so you're not going to be on the console, you'll mostly be managing it remotely, so you might as well just use Core. As a read-only domain controller server for a remote branch office, for example. As a VM server to reduce the amount of resources. In other words, if you're running it as a VM, your VMs might have the GUI, but there's no reason to have the GUI on the server hosting those VMs. It's just additional resources that are simply not needed. As a specialized single-role server providing services such as DNS, DHCP, a web server, file services, and so forth, you could also install just ServerCore. And again, it's going to reduce the footprint of the server, or maybe just a server serving a single department or having a single task. If you need to run any of these roles, you're going to have to install the GUI. So the GUI is required if you're using Active Directory Federation services, if it's a fax server, a network policy and access services, remote desktop services, gateway session host and web access, volume activation services, Windows deployment services. So any of these roles, if you're planning on using those, you're going to have the GUI installed in order to use those roles. There simply is no other way to configure them, and it's required to have the GUI to do that. You may not necessarily be able to do that remotely like some of the other roles and services that we've talked about. A ServerCore installation is almost identical to the full installation. So you're going to follow the same process that I talked about in the beginning of this presentation. The only real difference is that you choose ServerCore installation when you're prompted to select which operating system to install. But everything else will remain roughly the same as you go through that list. Except when you get to the first time you log in, you're going to get a command prompt instead of the server manager. So obviously you've installed the GUI version, you'll get the server manager, but in this case you will not get the server manager. So some of the first tasks when you're using ServerCore, very similar to installing the GUI version. You're going to have to set your IP address. You're going to have to name the server, just like we talked about before. You'll still have to activate the server. And there are different methods you can use for each of these tasks. And if you look in your textbook, activities 10-2-10 through 2-13 in your textbook step you through each of those tasks. This presentation may be used for versions of the textbook that may change over time. So you may have to look for activities in the textbook that show you or demonstrate this for you. But there are activities that should be available for you to show you how to do those three basic tasks. But you will need to know how to do those tasks in order to perform a ServerCore installation. And again, you won't be able to connect to that server until it has a name, it's activated, and it has an IP address. Once you've done those things, then you'll be able to manage that server remotely using the server manager from another server. But it is important to be able to set at least those three things in ServerCore without having to use a GUI since you don't have a GUI. So when it's the first server, so when would you not use a ServerCore? Microsoft recommends not using ServerCore when it's the first server in a network. The reason being that you will not have any of the tools to configure the server. While you can use the command line tools to do most of the configurations, generally it's easier to do so with the GUI, and many administrators don't even know how to use some of those command line tools. You have to Google everything, basically. I'm sorry, you might have to Microsoft Bing everything since this is a Windows class. So when you need to install server roles and features that a ServerCore does not support, you won't be able to use ServerCore, which we talked about earlier. Or if the server administrator is either not well versed in using the command line programs or prefers not to use those, or prefers not to use the remote administration tools. And of course, if you just can't live without a GUI, some people just need to have that GUI. It's the, kind of a nice thing to have that they feel like they need to have. So if you can't get past that, then by all means, go ahead and install the GUI. But understand that ServerCore is great if you need to reduce that server's footprint. So it's good to get used to that command line version of the OS. Okay, in the next video, I'm going to talk about features on demand, which is a new way of managing roles with Windows Server. So we'll talk about that in the next presentation.